Welcome to my new series, Will It Jerk? I've got a surplus of Scotch bonnet chilies and I'm on a mission to put them to good use by taking some classic dishes and giving them a Jamaican twist with some homemade jerk seasoning. First up, I'll be infusing focaccia bread with the bold flavours of jerk, then I'll be breathing new life into classic hash browns, and finally I'll be taking your taste buds on a trip with Jamaican jerk hot oil noodles. So will they jerk? Stay tuned to the end to find out, and let's get adventurous. First up is focaccia genovese. For one sheet pan sized focaccia, I'm measuring out 325 grams of bread flour and putting that into a bowl. Then I'll need about 175 grams of warm water. I find the quickest way to get warm water is to start with a cold kettle, turn it on, wait a couple of seconds until you hear it start to make noise, pick it up, give it a swirl, and you should have some nice warm water. This amount of water equates to only around 52% hydration. This is quite a low level of hydration for a focaccia dough. Normally they're up around 70% plus for the big fluffy spongy styles of focaccia, but this particular style of focaccia is a little bit thinner and a little bit crisper, so the lower hydration should be just perfect. Then to the warm water, I'm adding 5 grams of honey and 4 grams of dried yeast. Then I'm giving that a stir and leaving it for 5 to 10 minutes for the yeast to hydrate and become active. And the next step is where we start to bring in the Jamaican seasoning. Traditional jerk cooking revolves around allspice and Scotch bonnet chilies, and usually involves marinating or dry rubbing cuts of meat for cooking over an open flame to get a smoky, charred finish. That's not exactly what I'm doing here today, but I am taking inspiration from that and working with that same flavor profile focused around allspice and Scotch bonnets. Now, I'm no expert in Jamaican food, so if you think I'm getting these flavor combinations a little bit off, jump into the comments down below and let me know. I'm starting by adding all my dry spices to the flour. I thought the dough would be the best place to add the dry spices, so I'm starting here with half a teaspoon each of allspice, dried thyme, and cinnamon powder. Then I'm grating in about a quarter of a teaspoon of nutmeg and a generous few cranks of freshly ground black pepper. And this is already starting to smell good. Now that my yeast has dissolved and has started to get bubbly, I'm adding 15 grams of extra virgin olive oil, followed by 6.5 grams of salt. Make a well in the center of the dry ingredients and pour in the yeast mix. Stir with a wooden spoon until it all comes together into a shaggy ball of dough. Some flours absorb more or less water than other flours. My dough's looking a bit dry, so I'm adding another splash of warm water from the kettle. Once it's all come together with the wooden spoon, I'm mixing it with my hands a little bit just to make sure there's no dry flour. Once that's come together, I'm going to let it rest for about 20 minutes. This will allow all of the flour to fully hydrate, which will in turn allow the gluten to develop much easier. After 20 minutes, you'll be able to tell that the flour is fully hydrated because the dough will be nice and smooth and supple and easy to work with. I'm going to work this just a little bit by repeatedly folding the outside into the center. This should help to start the gluten development, but this is basically a no-knead recipe, so after a few folds, I'm covering it in cling film and leaving it in the fridge to rise overnight. The next day the dough will be risen. Because it's a lower hydration, it may not rise as much as other doughs, but it should still be nice and soft and springy. Turn the dough out onto a well-floured surface and start to shape it. I'm using a rolling pin to roll this into a rectangle. With a normal high hydration focaccia dough, you'd be putting this straight into a well-oiled pan and shaping it there, but because this dough is a bit thicker and a bit denser, I found it easier to shape by rolling it out first. Once you've got it roughly into the shape of a rectangle, if it's still looking a bit round, I like to adjust it by hand by gently pulling out the corners into a more rectangular shape. Now, comparing this to the size of my sheet pan, it's looking like it's about the right size. Now, normally focaccia goes straight into a well-oiled sheet pan, but I have had these stick before, so I'm not taking any chances and I'm using some baking paper. The tricky thing about baking paper is that it's flat, and baking trays tend to have a ridge around the edge. As a result, it's quite hard to get the baking paper to sit neatly in the tray. I used to mess around trying to perfectly fold up the edges into a rectangular shape so that the baking paper would perfectly fit the inside of the tray. That is, until someone showed me this really simple trick. Instead of trying to fold it into the perfect shape, just screw it up into a ball. That way when you flatten it out, you'll find it's much more flexible, and with a little pushing and poking, it'll conform to the shape of your tray. Even though we're using baking paper, I'm still putting down a generous amount of extra virgin olive oil. This will help the bottom of the focaccia to crisp up nicely and will also contribute to the flavor. Then I'm laying the dough into the baking tray. Whoops. A little bit clumsily, but that's okay, that's easy fixed. We'll We'll flatten that back out, there we go, and then finish shaping with your fingers. At this point I'm covering this with an identical baking tray and leaving it to rest and rise for 30 minutes. While I'm waiting for that, I'm going to zest one lime and squeeze the juice into a jug. This style of focaccia gets its salt from a brine that's sprinkled over the top before baking, so I'm going to incorporate the juice of the lime into that brine. So I'm taking my lime juice and then topping that up with water to about 100 ml. To this I'm adding 5 grams of salt and stirring until it's dissolved. And now the final topping for the focaccia, Scotch bonnet peppers. These peppers are really common in Jamaican cuisine. They're really hot and spicy, but also very sweet and very fruity. So I've got 4 large Scotch bonnets and I'm starting by slicing those in half, slicing those halves into strips and then slicing those strips into a fine dice. And now is about the time that I'm going to start preheating my oven to 230 degrees Celsius. It's now been about 30 minutes and my dough has now had a chance to rest and slightly rise. I'm now going to make some indentations in the dough by taking 3 fingers and pushing them into the dough, pushing forward slightly, working all the way down the dough until I get to the other end, and then repeating this until all of the dough surface is covered in dimples. These dimples will stop the dough from rising unevenly or getting too much rise, and they'll also catch all of the brine and olive oil that will spread on top. I'm sprinkling a generous handful of flour over the top of the dough. This flour will become wet from the brine, which will form a bit of a slurry or batter. This should give an extra layer of crunch and help the toppings to stick. Once it's had a nice even sprinkling of flour, on goes the lime infused brine. I want to get a fairly even coverage with this, so I'm using a soup spoon to sprinkle the brine over the surface. I don't necessarily need to use all of the brine. Once the bread's nice and evenly covered, that should be enough. Now that the brine's been added, I'm drizzling over a generous amount of extra virgin olive oil. This is about 30 grams of olive oil, but it doesn't need to be too precise. And now it's time to add the toppings. So I'm sprinkling over the lime zest, trying to get the coverage as even as possible, and then doing the same with the Scotch bonnets. Then I'm covering that and giving it one last chance to rest and rise for about 20 to 30 minutes. Throw that into your preheated oven and bake it for 15 minutes. Check it after 15 minutes and see if it needs a bit longer. It should be nice and crispy on the top and the edges and evenly browned. So this is the finished product. It looks nice and crisp on the top and the edges. A lot of the brine and the oil has soaked into the bread, but you can still see a little bit still resting in the dimples. The lime zest is toasted up and is pretty much completely blackened. If I was going to cook this recipe again, I'd definitely put the lime zest on after cooking so that you still get that nice fresh fragrance and vibrant green color. This smells fantastic. It's got that beautiful fresh bread smell accompanied by the nice warming spices and a hint of citrus. I'm really curious to see how this tastes and answer the question, will it jerk? And yes, it will. This is really good. The bread is thin, it's really light and crispy. There's a lovely crispness and crunch to the outside, and the middle is beautifully light and fluffy. But the flavor is absolutely where it's at. The spices in the dough are mellow and warming, really comforting. The heat and the fruitiness from these chilies really livens up your palate, and then the zippy, zingy citrus salt brine brings the whole thing to life and makes it taste really exciting. I'm not gonna lie, the charred lime zest is less than ideal. It still tastes pretty good, but it would be better sprinkled on fresh right at the end. I'll keep that in mind for next time. I will absolutely be making this again to share with friends. If you'd like to support the channel, check out the affiliate links in the description, or just hit the like button and consider subscribing. Here's another video you might be interested in, and until next time, happy snacking. Okay, buddy. Okay. You in? I gotta get back to this video.